Imagine an Apple Watch, but with better battery life and close to half the price tag. Well, that's what the Huawei Watch Fit 3 promises to be, and it's also compatible with both Android and iOS. On paper, it seems to address many of the common complaints people have about the Apple Watch. But that's not why many of you have been urging me to review it. The buzz is all about Huawei's claims of improved health and sports tracking. So today we're diving into my initial test of the Huawei Watch Fit 3. And I have to say, in terms of design at least, this is my favorite Huawei product in a while. I think the new square shape is just so much nicer than the elongated shape that the previous Huawei Watch Fit had. But enough about aesthetics and specifications, let's jump straight into the testing and see how the smartwatch really performs. As always, I want to start off with the heart rate tracking performance, and here you can see an overview of that performance for one of the easiest exercises for a watch to track indoor cycling, which I tested on myself for 3 sessions. Now I already did more testing, but one reason this review took longer than normal is because I'm having issues getting to the raw data from the Huawei app, so I'll have to rely on a limited data set for now. However, I still think the data is good enough for some solid first impressions. Now to test the heart rate tracking performance, I'll compare the measurements against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. Each dot in this plot is a single heart rate measurement, with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the Watch Fit 3. Now the closer the points are to this blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots that there are. And as you can see, this generally looks pretty good actually. Most points are on or close to the blue line at least. Interestingly, mostly in the lower heart rate range right here do we see a bit more deviation, both below the blue line, but especially above it, also here in the medium heart rate range. Still, this looks really good, and the correlation is quite high at 0.98, so that's this R value up here, and this value cannot be higher than 1, so a correlation of 0.98 is pretty good. But let's take a look at the individual spinning sessions to see why we have a deviation, especially here in the lower heart rate range. And here we have the first example interval spinning session, where we actually see a pretty decent agreement between the Watch Fit 3 and the ECG chest strap. In the higher heart rate range is almost spot on, but in the breaks between my segments there's a bit more deviation. We can see some right here, and also right here there's a tiny bit more deviation, but overall honestly this looks really good. And for this second spinning session it looks even better honestly. Every time I took a break it caught it almost perfectly, so that looks really good. And for this final short example we see some deviation, for instance right here and a little bit right here, but again overall this would be good enough for me. Next, let's compare this performance to that of other watches, because at least looking at the results so far it seems quite good, but another watch might actually perform better. By the way, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. I should also note that Huawei sent me the Watch Fit 3 to test, but it will go back to them after I'm done testing. But okay, back to the results and the testing. And that overview is displayed right here. Now the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric I'll use for this, which is displayed along the horizontal axis. And we want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. And on the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And here I marked the Huawei Watch Fit 3 in red. And as you can see, it's amongst the top performers. It has one of the highest correlations out there, and most watches are performing more poorly. But let's zoom in a bit so we can actually read these labels. And here we have that zoomed in view with just the watches of a correlation of 0.90 or higher, so just the better performing watches. And even amongst these, the Huawei Watch Fit 3 is one of the better performers. It's actually super close to the Huawei Watch Fit 2, so I suspect they perform more or less similarly, and it's in between the 41 and 46mm versions of the Huawei Watch GT4. So overall very similar in performance to other Huawei devices, not better or worse I would say. Only the Apple Watch is still clearly outperforming the Huawei watches. They're really a lot better than the rest, but I suspect the Huawei Watch Fit 3 is good enough in performance for most people. And if you're curious, other watches that are close are for instance the Pixel Watch 2, which is also a good performer on Android but with poor battery life, and also the Polar Verity Sense, a dedicated heart rate monitor. So the Huawei Watch Fit 3 is doing quite well compared to the competition. Overall, the Watch Fit 3 is doing really well for the price, at least for indoor cycling. It's not quite as good as the Apple Watch, but it's super close. And given the difference in battery life and price, that's quite impressive honestly. However, cycling indoors is a relatively easy exercise for a watch to track, so let's make things much more difficult and let's see how the Huawei Watch Fit 3 did for cycling outside. This is a lot more difficult because of the increased bumpiness and increased tension on my arm. Let's have a look. And as you can see, for cycling outside, we do have a slightly decreased performance compared to cycling indoors, but honestly, it still looks pretty good. The correlation is now 0.93, so not quite as high as the 0.98 from before, but still pretty good. And we again see that in the higher heart rate range, the device is really accurate, so most points are on or close to the blue line, and most deviation is here in the lower heart rate range. This is actually opposite to what we see for many other devices, where many other devices tend to be better in the lower heart rate range for cycling outside. It appears to be the opposite for the Huawei Watch Fit 3. But let's take a look at the individual rides to see why this could be. Now, as I said, in total, I did 6 different rides, and this was the longest one by far, so over 2 hours. And you can see here that in the higher heart rate range, it seems almost spot on. Only in the lower heart rate range do we see a bit more deviation. So again, this explains what we saw in the overview plot. But because this ride took so long, it did have a relatively big contribution to the overview plot we were looking at before. And I do have to say, this second ride I wanted to share was the worst one out of all 6 rides. So here in the beginning, it had quite a big deviation from the reference, detecting a way too low heart rate. Later on, it's actually a lot better. But most rides are luckily a lot better. This one still struggled a little bit, as you can see right here, but also here near the peaks of my heart rate. But this ride, for instance, in general looks a lot better, though there's a bit of deviation right here. And in this final example, we see pretty decent agreement. This is a lot better than what most watches do. So it's not perfect, but it might be good enough. But to answer that question, let's see how it performed compared to other watches out there. And here we have a similar overview to before, but now for cycling outside. And again, we want the watches to be as far to the top right as possible. And as you can see, the Huawei Watch Fit 3 in red is again amongst the top performers, which is really good. And again, it's really close to the Huawei Watch Fit 2, but we need to zoom in to read those labels. And here we have that zoomed in view with, in this case, just the watches of a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And as you can see, even amongst these better performing watches, the Huawei Watch Fit 3 is doing really well. It is doing a tiny bit worse in this overview than the Huawei Watch Fit 2, though we can in no way claim this difference is significant since I only have a limited set of data for the Watch Fit 3. Still, overall, both the Watch Fit 2 and Watch Fit 3 are some of the top performers out there, even seemingly a little bit better than some of the other bigger Huawei devices. That could have to do with their weight, or again, it could be random chance. But we actually see that the GT3 Pro is doing a bit better, so I wouldn't be so sure of that. I think again that many Huawei watches are performing more or less similarly. The only one again outperforming them is the Apple Watch. So if you want the best heart rate tracking on the wrist, the Apple Watch really seems to be best at that, but different Huawei watches are a close second. Other good devices include, for instance, the similarly priced Fitbit Charge 6, the Pixel Watch 2, which is more expensive and has a poorer battery life, and the Coral Space 3 might also be good enough. Still, overall, the Huawei Watch Fit 3 is doing really well, so I'm not disappointed so far. So also for cycling outside, the Watch Fit 3 is doing really well. It seems to be amongst the top performers, though I would like to see some more data to be sure that what we're seeing is reproducible in the long run, especially given the relatively easy longer ride that was included. Next, let's take a look at one of the hardest exercises for a watch to track. However, before showing you those results, I'm hoping that my diligent testing has earned a subscribe from you, and it also really helps me to get access to devices sooner if you leave a like or a comment. But enough self-promotion, let's take a look at the performance of the Huawei Watch Fit 3 for weightlifting. Weightlifting is one of those exercises that most watches struggle with because there's so much tension on my arm, and the same is true to a degree for the Huawei Watch Fit 3. We can indeed see that there's more deviation from the blue line than before, and especially many more points below the blue line right here, but still overall compared to other watches this isn't as bad. The correlation is a lot lower now at 0.81, but again compared to other watches it could be a lot worse. But here we really need to take a look at the individual weightlifting sessions to see how big the problem actually is. And here we have the first weightlifting session I wanted to share with you, with again the Polar H 10 in blue-green and the Huawei Watch Fit 3 in red. And as you can see, only some peaks were fully captured by the Huawei Watch Fit 3, some were partially captured and some were not captured at all. So it's a bit of a mix. Some parts of the training were really good, whereas others weren't so good. And we see something similar for this second weightlifting session. It's far from perfect, missing many of the peaks in my heart rate. And that's also what we see for this final example I wanted to show you right here, especially here in the beginning it struggled, here in the middle it's a bit better, and near the end it's a bit of a mix, but let's compare it to many of the other devices out there. And here we have a similar overview to before, but now for weightlifting, and in this case the Watch Fit 3 is in the upper middle class of watches, but not amongst the actual top performers, and the Huawei Watch Fit 2 is, and I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if this is just random chance with a better data collection for the Watch Fit 2, or if there's actually something better about it. So I really need to collect more data. The Watch Fit 3 is close to some other Huawei devices, the GT4 in this case, also the Huawei Band 7, but some other Huawei devices are seemingly doing a bit better. So the Watch Fit 2 we were looking at before, but also the GT3 Pro. But again, I don't know if this is because of the type of exercises I did or what's going on here. It could, for instance, be that I did more lower body exercises for some of these tests, and I did actually no lower body exercise with the Watch Fit 3, and lower body exercises are generally easier for a watch to track. So I have to collect more data and see. Overall, the heart rate tracking performance of the Huawei Watch Fit 3 is quite good in my opinion. It's not quite as good as the Apple Watch, but given the increased battery life, it's doing really well actually. We also potentially saw some slight differences in performance compared to the previous Huawei Watch Fit 2, but I don't dare to call those differences significant based on the limited data set I collected so far. And for those of you that are wondering, unfortunately I couldn't do a test for running outside because of an injury. Still, overall, I'm quite happy with the performance of the Huawei Watch Fit 3 so far. Only for weightlifting I cannot recommend it, but for the other sports so far it's doing quite well. Therefore, overall, I give the heart rate tracking performance 4 to maybe even 4.5 out of 5 stars, but that's considering the price. But what about the sleep stage tracking? Huawei introduced the new Huawei True Sleep 4.0 algorithm for their sleep tracking, but is it any better than the previous generations? Let's take a look. To test the sleep stage tracking performance, I'll compare the Huawei Watch Fit 3 against the Z-Max EEG headband, which can actually measure my brain waves. Now this device also has its limitations, especially when it comes to detecting awake time, but it'll give us a rough impression of the sleep stage tracking performance of the Watch Fit 3. And here I show an overview of the results for a total of 4 nights. Now on top are the sleep stages as recorded by the Z-Max EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Watch Fit 3. And each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Z-Max was predicted as each sleep stage by the Watch Fit 3. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. Now, first of all, we see that only about 36% of what was deep sleep according to the EEG device was also detected as deep sleep by the Huawei Watch Fit 3, so that's not very good. More of it was actually predicted as being light sleep instead at about 45%. Now, light sleep agreement is also not that great at about 45%, and a lot of the light sleep detected by the EEG device was actually predicted as being deep sleep or REM sleep by the Watch Fit 3. REM sleep agreement is similar at about 44% agreement, and about the same amount was actually predicted as being light sleep instead at about 40%. So overall, not looking very good for the Watch Fit 3. Now, awake time is something we will definitely not be focusing on because the Z-Max tends to detect a lot of awake moments, some of which I think are not really awake moments or just short arousals, and those are not interesting for us. But just for completeness, about 29% of what was awake time according to the EEG device was also detected as awake time by the Huawei Watch Fit 3. Now, looking at the nights themselves will help us understand that even better, and here you can see the first night I wanted to share with you. On top, we have the sleep stages according to the Z-Max EEG headband, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom, we have a similar plot, but now for the Huawei Watch Fit 3. And in purple right here, I highlighted the deep sleep as recorded by the EEG device. And as you can see, there's marginal agreement with the Watch Fit 3. Some of the deep sleep has at least some agreement, but later on, the deep sleep detected by the Watch Fit 3 differs a lot. It detects a lot of deep sleep right here later in the night, and this is not what a typical night of sleep should look like. You have most deep sleep in the first half of your night, and you have most REM sleep in the second half of your night. And for the Watch Fit 3, it appears to be opposite in this case. So this is not looking that great. Now, the general patterns might look a bit better for this second example night, so with more deep sleep in the first half of the night and more REM sleep in the second half. But the overall agreement with the EEG device is still not very good, though arguably a bit better. But overall, this isn't looking very good. And also the REM sleep agreement isn't very good. So here I mark the REM sleep as detected by the EEG device in red. And as you can see, this doesn't match very well with the Watch Fit 3. But some of the REM sleep patterns might slightly match. So this first, second and fourth REM sleep segment show at least some overlap, but the duration is different. And this third one is completely missed. And for this second example night, it looks arguably even a bit worse. So in the beginning, there's basically no overlap. Later in the night, it might be a bit better. Still, generally, I wouldn't rely on the REM sleep tracking of the Watch Fit 3. And again, I said we wouldn't focus on awake moments, but just to show you that the general pattern shows some agreement, the longer awake moments sometimes agree between the EEG device and the Watch Fit 3. So I wouldn't really trust the EEG device here, but if we just look at the longer awake moments, so this is the longest one right here, this was also detected by the Watch Fit 3. And looking at this second night, we see poorer agreement, but the moment I fell asleep and moment I woke up at least roughly match. And for this third example night I wanted to show you, we see that the two longest awake moments agree between the Watch Fit 2 and the EEG device, and also the moment I fell asleep and woke up are pretty much in line. So though we cannot really judge the awake moments detected by the Watch Fit 3, this might actually be the best out of all the sleep stages. So the sleep stage tracking performance of the Watch Fit 3 just doesn't seem that great. Both the deep sleep and REM sleep agreement are quite low, and only the awake detection seems potentially decent enough. So my first instinct is that you can use the Watch Fit 3 to detect your total time in bed and maybe your total sleep time, but even with the new True Sleep 4.0 algorithm, you cannot really rely on the sleep stage tracking. However, let's put these results into context and let's compare them against the performance of many other devices out there. And that is exactly what we can see right here. So this graph shows an overview of the agreement of different watches with different reference devices. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. So the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. Now this overview is slightly complicated because I use different reference devices. The devices not marked in any color were tested against the Dream 2 EEG headband, my normal reference, but Dream went bankrupt, so I cannot use it anymore. The devices marked in green were tested against the ZMAX EEG device, so the one we used in this video, and the devices marked in blue-purple were tested against polysomnography or PSG, so the gold standard in sleep stage tracking. And you can see the Huawei Watch Fit 3 right here. So it's actually really close to some other Huawei devices. So for instance, the Huawei Watch GT4, both the 46 and 41mm versions, but also the Huawei Watch Fit 2 tested with a different reference device though. But overall, it seems to be in the same area as I always find Huawei devices. So in the lower half right here, so really among some of the poorer performing watches. If you want some of the best sleep stage tracking out there, on me, Apple watches perform very well. But in a recent video I made, we saw that Oura Ring and Apple are some of the top performers out there if we also include the scientific literature. Other devices that are doing really well include the 8 Sleep Pods, so both the 3 and 4 are performing about the same, I would say. And in the group of second tier devices, we have different Fitbit and Google devices. So Google owns Fitbit and likely uses the same algorithm across all its devices. And also the Whoop strap is quite good. Not quite as well as, for instance, Apple, Oura and 8 Sleep, but still doing really well. And Whoop is a better sports tracker than Oura, for instance. So it really depends on what you're looking for. But both Oura and Whoop require a subscription, which is not so nice. There are different Fitbit devices out there though that have decent sleep stage tracking. And for now, at least, it doesn't require a subscription for the sleep stage tracking. So overall, the sleep stage tracking performance of the Watch Fit 3 just isn't very good. At least it doesn't seem to be on me. If you just want to know roughly how much time you spent in bed or time asleep, it might be good enough. However, this first testing seems to indicate you might not want to rely on the actual sleep stages. Therefore, overall, I'd give the sleep stage tracking performance of the Huawei Watch Fit 3 2 out of 5 stars. Next, I would normally do a complete test of the GPS tracking during cycling, but unfortunately I don't have enough data for that as of yet. However, I do want to share my first impressions. But before doing that, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter after the summer to share my first results with you sooner. And if you're interested, check out the link up here. Now, the way I normally test these devices is that I cycle the same route maybe 4 or 5 times to see how well the signals overlap. And if a watch is good at GPS tracking, you'd expect the signals to be very close. However, so far I only tracked the same route twice, and those results are displayed right here. I want to warn you though to take these results with a very large grain of salt. Now, I never give watches any extra time to acquire the GPS signal, and in this case I started one ride right here and one right here. So one time it maybe took half a minute for it to acquire the GPS signal, but overall this is very fast. And if we then look at the consistency between the signals, this is actually quite good. The signals are very close together, showing very little deviation, maybe a little deviation right here and right here, a bit more right here, but the overall track is looking really good. Now we only have 2 signals, so we don't want to overinterpret these results, but generally the signals seem to be quite close together, so that's looking really good. They might deviate a bit from the roads, but it could even be that this map overlay isn't perfect. So overall this just hints at potential good GPS tracking by the Huawei Watch Fit 3. The one thing I did notice though is that the signals seem to be a bit smooth potentially. So when I go around the corner, it seems to be a bit smooth smoothed out. So it might be artificially smoothing the result, making the consistency artificially seeming a bit better. And it might even be using the map data to push the signals on top of the road. So even a further artificial improvement, but we cannot really be sure of this. Still, overall, this is a good first impression. I don't have enough data yet to draw any definitive conclusions about the GPS tracking performance of the Huawei Watch Fit 3. However, at first glance, it does look promising. Overall, the Watch Fit 3 seems like a solid device. For about 160 euros or dollars, you get good quality heart rate tracking and what seems to be decent GPS tracking. However, the sleep stage tracking just isn't very good, so it only uses to track my total time in bed. Considering the price point and the good battery life, it is a solid choice, and it could be an Apple Watch alternative for those people on Android focusing on sports tracking, or even for people on iOS that don't like the limited battery life of the Apple Watch. I should note though that it might be difficult for people in the US to get any Huawei device and also this Huawei Watch Fit 3, and it might take a while for it to be listed on Amazon. Additionally, there's also one small thing that bugs me personally about the screen of the Watch Fit 3. Now this might be my slight OCD rearing its head, because overall it's a beautiful display, but I see it every time I look at it. And that is that at least optically the bezels on top and bottom seem to be slightly bigger than those on the sides. Again, this is a super small thing and really quite personal, but for me it does take away from some of the beauty of this device. All in all though, I do like the Huawei Watch Fit 3 and I have no problem recommending it to people that want a well-priced smartwatch with good heart rate tracking. Therefore overall I'd likely give it about 3.5 out of 5 stars generally, but given the low price I might just bump it up closer to 4 stars, with the caveat that the sleep stage tracking just isn't reliable enough. Now of course the results I showed you today might vary from person to person, so please also check out some other reviewers. If you do decide to get a Huawei watch, a Whoop strap, an Aura ring, an H-Sleep Pod 3, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, want to potentially save some money and at the same time support the channel, there are different affiliate and non-affiliate links in the description below. They do not cost you any extra and some even provide a discount. Now given that you watched this whole video on the Huawei Watch Fit 3, check out this video on the previous generation, the Watch Fit 2, or this video on my top recommendations for sleep tracking. Thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.